I'm John Rodgers, and today's subject is Dwight Eisenhower. The title slide that you're looking at is photographed on a 48-star flag. And for Eisenhower, that's significant because it will be 50 when he leaves office. The Eisenhower family was in deep financial trouble when Ike was born in Denison, Texas on October 14, 1890, in that home. They had moved there to find work, and times were really hard. But 2 years later, the family moved back to Abilene, Kansas. And Ike always considered Abilene his home, this home. The toughness of life remained, and each boy, 7 but 1 died, Ike was the 3rd, was expected to help. And some of the help was in this creamery where his father worked and where Ike worked. Prayer and the Bible were a daily part of life, and morals were strict. The moral code about the avoidance of violence was the hardest one to police. Now, before we go on, here is the Eisenhower family. I'll go through it once, and you'll see a photograph of them grown after this, and you're supposed to remember those. This is the father, David, and the mother, Ida. Milton always gets put in the middle. And this is Dwight, this is Edgar, Earl, Arthur, and Roy. Fighting was a part of growing up in Abilene, and Ike had his share. Remember that this had been a cattle town, the northern terminus of the Chisholm Trail. And that meant that not many years had gone by since Abilene had been a real wild western town. And the prairies at that time looked like this. Then in 1905, when he was only 15, blood poisoning prompted doctors to say that Ike's leg would have to be amputated. Ike made Edgar, his older brother, promise that no such operation would take place. Ike made it through that incident of near disaster and went on to his favorite pastimes of baseball and football. In 1910, when he applied for the U.S. Naval Academy, turns out he was too old for that, he found that the same exam was also used for the military academy at West Point, and he won an appointment there. And you're looking out on the great Hudson River. Actually, this was quite a blow to his parents, David and Ida, who were lifetime pacifists. His real ambition at that time was to be a great football star for Army, but it was not to be. He suffered a severe knee injury, and that was that. He graduated in 1915, 61st in a class of 168. This class was known as the class the stars fell on, because so many went on to become generals. 59 cadets gained 111 stars. Omar Bradley was one of them. And this is a monument, a Civil War monument at West Point. Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas. Now, I don't have a photograph of Fort Sam Houston, and so you're going to look at the Alamo. But Fort Sam Houston was Ike's first post, and it was a milestone in another way, for it was here that he met Mamie Dowd of Denver, Colorado. Mamie's family was socially and financially well off. He married Mamie and became a first lieutenant on the same day, July the 1st, 1916. Their first son, Doug Davis Ickey, was born in 1917. And here is one of those early pictures of Ickey. In 1918, Ike took over command of the Tank Training Center at Camp Colt, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and thus started the Eisenhower love affair with the area. And you're looking at cannons on the Confederate lines. And Ike learned a lot and taught a lot about tank warfare, even though at Camp Colt he had no tanks until after World War I. He was quite conscious of the fact that he had been kept out of battlefield activity during the war. And this picture shows some of that frustration in his face. His next post was Camp Meade, Maryland. And at this camp, he had tanks, and he also met George Patton. And then on January the 2nd, 1921, in Mamie's words, a shining light went out in Ike's life. Ickey died of scarlet fever. His death was a tragedy from which we never recovered. Those are Ike's words 25 years later. And even when president, upon seeing yellow daffodils, he remarked that they had been Ike's favorite color. In 1922, Ike was sent to the Panama Canal Zone for duty. In that same year, the Eisenhower's second and last child was born, John. He, quote, did much to fill the gap that we felt so poignantly and so deeply every day of our lives, end of quote. John later followed his father to West Point and into a military career. In Panama, General Fox Connor took a strong liking to Ike and went a long way to prepare him for command. At the same time, Mrs. Connor was helping Mamie through a time following the death of Icky when the Eisenhower marriage was coming apart. 40 years later, Ike called the general, Fox Connor, the ablest man I ever knew. And that's saying a lot for some of the men that Eisenhower knew. General Connor helped arrange for Ike to go to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where Ike finished first this time in a class of 275. The marriage of Ike and Mamie survived many things, including living in 20 different places for a year or more during the years of 1916 to 1961. Ike had a temper, and that was part of the problem. But Mamie was a strong person in her own right. You didn't push Mamie too far or too hard on anything. A little known but very meaningful tour of duty was assignment to the Battle Monuments Commission, which was involved in the preparation of a guidebook. Now, Ike's in civilian clothes here, but he was a major at this time. Not only did he work for the retired General Pershing, but he also met the battlefields of France. Pershing's reaction to Ike's work, as given in a letter of commendation, has been called a turning point in Ike's career. Then it was on to the top of a soldier's classroom preparation, the Army War College in Washington. During the years of 1932 to 1935, Ike was Special Assistant to General Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C. This time provided first-hand exposure to all sorts of issues, both national and international. And Ike had a tremendous capacity for absorbing information, feelings, leanings. He gave credit to MacArthur's intelligence, but thought that the line between military and politics should be firm, not like it was with MacArthur. Now, a note about Ike's brothers, and here is that adult picture that I told you you would see. All were considered successful in their various endeavors, but from the outside looking in, Milton stands out. He was president of 3 universities and was an advisor to 8 presidents, starting with Coolidge. Ike followed MacArthur to the Philippines and was there between 1936 and 39. Part of his job was aiding in the training of the Philippine Air Force, and Ike learned to fly. Friction continued with MacArthur, who wanted Ike to stay, but Eisenhower wanted no more and was transferred back to the States. In 1941, this man, General George Marshall, wanted to test a number of things dealing with how the Army would act in the field. Ike, now a brigadier general, was back at Fort Sam Houston as Chief of Staff of the 3rd Army. Marshall's plans called for maneuvers in Louisiana, and Eisenhower's strategy was perhaps the highlight of the largest military game ever carried out. Just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Ike was called to Washington, D.C. by General Marshall. His first assignment was to plan America's Pacific strategy, especially for the Philippines. Both of them knew that the Philippines could not be saved, but they knew that the effort must be made. It was Eisenhower, directed by President Roosevelt and General Marshall, who drafted the order for MacArthur to leave the Philippines and go to Melbourne, Australia, to command the Southwest Pacific Theater. Then Ike became chief of the Operations Division and with his staff was responsible for planning the strategy for opening a second front in Europe with an invasion of France. Now, before we take Eisenhower over to London, at this point, step back to the summer of 1940 for a reminder of what had already gone on. On June 18, 1940, Winston Churchill spoke these words: "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the light of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." During that summer of 1940, young men of the Royal Air Force rose to meet the Nazi planes in the Battle of Britain. The top of the chalk cliffs of Beachy Head, which you're looking at, was one of the locations of early radar. As you drive and walk over the South Downs of England today, it's hard to visualize the battles that took place in the now peaceful sky. And many of those encounters ended in flames, and often it was a Royal Air Force Hurricane or a Spitfire that went down. As the battle raged on, the Nazis turned much of their effort towards London, the period called the Blitz. And here's probably the most famous picture that came out of the Blitz: St. Paul's still standing. The odds were all in favor of the Nazi forces, but by the end of October, even though Nazi raids continued, the Battle of Britain was over, and Britain had already achieved its finest hour. And Mr. Churchill said, "Never in the field of human conflict have so many owed so much to so few." And I ask that you remember that we are a part of that so many. I'll show you two of these murals, and they are found in the museum out at the Eisenhower Center in Abilene, Kansas. In 1942, Ike was sent to London as commander of the European Theater of Operations, with such duties as organizer, planner, and worker with diverse leaders. Eisenhower was thinking in terms of a cross-channel invasion, but for the moment this was ruled out by the political leaders. That is a map of what D-Day finally became. Planning shifted to Torch, the invasion of North Africa. And during this time, Eisenhower met with Winston Churchill twice a week. Then Ike was given the command of British and American forces for the actual invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. And the picture you're looking at is number 10 Downing Street in London. Eisenhower's headquarters were located in dark and damp rooms in the Rock of Gibraltar. And that's the rock, but he was not so visible. He was down below in the rock. So they said it was very moist and very dark in there. The invasion started on October the 8th, 1942. And the final objective was a link-up with the British 8th Army and the capture or expulsion of all German forces from North Africa. Now, invasions took place at this point, and this point, and Montgomery was coming up this way, having defeated the Germans at El Alamein here. This is the Mediterranean Sea here, and this is Spain. The whole situation of how to handle the French and who should represent the French occupied much of Ike's time. No information about Torch was to go to the headquarters of General Charles de Gaulle. A leak was feared. Torch took Ike into international politics. Who was to represent France? General Henry Garrard, Admiral Dylan, assassinated on December the 24th, 1942, Marshal Pétain, or Governor Boston. And what I've stopped you on is in Morocco. This is the kind of countryside that the invading forces would see when they went through. And here's General Eisenhower with Henry Garrard. And then they would also see towns like this. This is a part of Tangiers. During all of this, and to the end in Europe, General Walter Bedell Smith, he's the one that they called Beetle Smith, was Ike's chief of staff. And Ike did confer at a number of times with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The biggest setback was the Germans' counterattack at Kasserine Gap, and that was indeed costly. It must be remembered that even though your forces have been winning, the enemy is still capable until you have destroyed him. But finally, the Allies pushed the German into the sea. They really wanted to destroy the German, and that's Eisenhower used the word in that way. And here he is with Churchill and Marshall and some of his staff. But many of the Germans actually got away over onto the mainland of Europe. The goals of Operation Torch, nevertheless, were achieved by May 13, 1943, under Eisenhower's command of all Allied forces. And here are some of the tank destroyer men here. Eisenhower then directed Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in the Mediterranean. The starting date was July 10, 1943. It was the largest amphibious operation ever and involved 3,300 ships. The capture of the town of Messina on August 17, 1943 meant that Sicily was completely under Allied control. By the time of this battle, Allied air cover was much improved and continued to improve through the rest of the war. And this is Ike with George Patton. The invasion of Italy started on September the 3rd, 1943, on the toe of Italy. I should say the mainland of Italy because, of course, Sicily is a part of Italy. Then landings on up the boot took place on the western side of the peninsula at Salerno. Now, Salerno is this side outside of the picture, maybe 5 miles. The going was tough and the Germans counterattacked, but the foothold had been made. The landings at Anzio were also met with strong resistance. And that's when this picture, and I thought we should have a picture of the enemy, Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. This was taken during the Battle of Anzio. Nothing in Italy was really settled by December 1943 when Eisenhower was named by President Roosevelt to head up Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. It had already been determined that an American would be the leader. And in January 1944, Ike left the Mediterranean area to return briefly to the United States and then to London. Thus, by the time the last German had left Rome on June 4th, 1944, attention had shifted to the Channel crossing. And this is the scene of a tremendous battle, Mount Cassino. This is south of Rome, and then I put in a picture of the Colosseum representing Rome. So Eisenhower was gone from the Italian theater, but we should not forget the Allied struggle in Italy. Ike was now back in the planning of Overlord with the title of Supreme Commander. But this was January 1944, and D-Day was scheduled for early May. Eisenhower moved out of the city as quickly as possible into Telegraph Cottage. It's about 11 miles southwest of London at Kingston upon Thames. Ike really functioned better in a small town environment. Captain Henry Butcher, his naval aide, lived with Eisenhower at Telegraph Cottage, as well as several other places throughout the war. Sergeant Michael McCowan was his orderly throughout the war. Sergeant Leonard Drive was his chief driver and was always the one called for when Eisenhower wanted to go to the front. And later on, he would be Mamie Eisenhower's driver. Every week, a long meeting was held at Winston Churchill's country home. The effort was intense, and the balance between participants across lines of nationality was maintained. Much depended on the shipping lanes from the United States, and the losses to Nazi U-boats was especially painful. And here is Ike with Montgomery, and he is the man that was the toughest to handle. He was always wanting to go his own way. One of the items that had to be assembled in great quantity was landing crafts. And a new word came into the terminology of war, mulberry, the word used for the designation of major artificial harbors. This is a mulberry that is set up off of the beaches of Normandy. The success of Overlord would depend on surprise, control of sea and air, the weather, and a relatively narrow front so that bombardment and bombings would be effective before the landings. And this is a natural amphitheater by Winchester, England. And this was loaded with troops just before D-Day. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think this is where this picture was taken, where Eisenhower was talking to the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, who would be the first in. The choice of May as the time of invasion went by the board, and June 5th became the working date for D-Day. Ike insisted on a much larger scale for the attack. He was supported, and the extra time was needed to expand the plans. This would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. 5,000 ships, including warships, 4,000 smaller landing crafts of various types, 11,000 aircraft, gliders, and ultimately almost 3 million men. One of the points for heading for Europe was this. This is the harbor of Plymouth, England. Back in here was just loaded with U.S. Army camps all during this preparation time. And just for a note of history, this is the dock from which the Mayflower finally sailed, bringing the pilgrims to the New World. The date of June 5th was postponed for 24 hours after Ike's weathermen were heard. I shouldn't put it that way. These were English weathermen. They were sure of about 36 hours of relative calm, although it was storming at the time. Eisenhower decided to go on June 6, 1944. And this is what it looked then, later that day, June 6. The next possible date was June 19th, which probably meant loss of surprise. And on that date, the worst storm in 20 years swept the English Channel. Eisenhower's magic held again. And another side note, Ike's son, John, graduated from the military academy on D-Day. Paratroopers and other airborne were sent behind the enemy lines. These are troops going ashore at Omaha Beach. And here are some of the paratroopers. 175,000 troops were ashore with 2,500 casualties in the first day. The mulberries were quickly put in place, and the build-up proceeded without let-up. Troops, tanks, various kinds of other vehicles, supplies, ammunition, food, everything that would be needed. The months of planning came through as a key in supplying the invading forces. The Germans started firing their V-1 flying bombs on June 13, 1944, and London was the big target. But by the end of June, the beachhead objectives had been accomplished, and it was time for the breakout into France. Omar Bradley's First Army began the sweep across France. And George Patton, and you're looking at his statue at West Point, George Patton and his Third Army, complete with tanks, made their move and began covering vast tracts of land. The objective of both was to destroy the German army. Then on August 15th, 1944, Operation Anvil, later called Dragoon, was set in motion with the invasion of southern France. Every one of the little white dots that you can see is a paratrooper going down. After some early heavy fighting, the 7th Army was able to move swiftly, and the link up with the other Allied forces in France was made in mid-September. In September 1944, a real setback occurred in an operation coded Market Garden. Its purpose was a bridgehead across the Rhine at Arnhem, Netherlands. It used airborne troops, was only partially successful, and involved heavy casualties, especially in British forces. And it took place not too far from this scene. This is the Rhine going through the Netherlands. No bridgehead had been achieved, but the lines protecting Antwerp, Belgium, had been extended. Market Garden gave notice that the German was going to fight to the death. Hitler then directed the Ardennes attack. He risked a lot, and though Allied forces were thrown back for a time, Hitler lost much in the battle. And this is the type of countryside, this is actually northern France, but this is the type of countryside that the battle was fought in. During the Ardennes battle, and I'm talking about the Battle of the Bulge, on December the 22nd, 1944, Eisenhower wrote one of his few orders of the day. Quote, "By rushing out from his fixed defenses, the enemy may give us a chance to turn his great gamble into his worst defeat. So I call upon every man of all the Allies to rise now to new heights of courage, of resolution, and of effort. Let everyone hold before him a single thought, to destroy the enemy on the ground, in the air, everywhere, destroy him. United in this determination and with unshakable faith in the cause for which we fight, we will, with God's help, go forward to our greatest victory." This was a battle in which Bastogne, Belgium, was surrounded, but would not surrender. Patton's forces finally broke through and relieved the unit at Bastogne. And this is Ike inspecting the battlefield. Many voices were raised that the battle never should have happened, but some counterattack by Hitler was bound to happen. The German was still strong and was still a long way from laying down his arms to the tune of unconditional surrender. The surprise was the place and the time. There was no way to prevent the start of an attack. Enemy losses were great, about 120,000 men and much equipment. Allied losses were also very heavy, 77,000, including about 8,000 killed. This battle brought forth some of the worst of Bernard Montgomery, and Ike continued to have his hands full in dealing with him. But thinking about what was to come, undoubtedly the crossing of the Rhine was made easier by the Battle of Ardennes. These are B-17s flying over Berlin and bombing. In the spring of 1945, Ike was urged, especially by the British, to go after Berlin, to take it before the Russians. Now, I've only been in West Berlin one time, but I understand that the ruins of this church are being left as, more or less as a reminder and as a shrine. The Russians at this time, when Ike was being urged, were only 35 miles away, while the closest Allied forces were 200 miles away. General Bradley had estimated casualties at 100,000. But Ike never considered the action for very long because he no longer considered Berlin a military target. See, here's what the division line ended up after the war. Berlin is all the way back in here. And after the war, until the toppling of the Iron Curtain, you had to go in one of these corridors. I've been in on that corridor and then out on this corridor. And you had to go through checkpoints each time. So you had 4 checkpoints, and it took a lot of time to do it. Ike had been told by the engineers that it might not be possible to cross the Rhine River before May 1945. No timetables were changed, and the advances up to the Rhine continued with the clearing of the German from the western side. Later, the technical advice was drastically changed, and crossings went forward much earlier. Indeed, a surprise crossing was made on March 7th, when the Third Corps found the bridge at Remagen damaged but intact. And that's the Ludendorff bridge that you're looking at. That's the one that was still intact. Bradley called Eisenhower, and the result was that 5 divisions were pushed across the Rhine right then and there. That's George Patton with his arm in the air. He seemed to have his arm in the air quite a bit. But this was the usual method for crossing the Rhine on pontoon bridges. The Ruhr, the industrial might of Germany, was encircled, and by April the 18th, the whole military force there gave up. 30 German generals were in the 325,000 who were captured. What do you do with 325,000 prisoners? I really don't know. Ike was with General Patton most of April 12, 1945. Patton's men were still cleaning up resistance and taking prisoners. The date was memorable for both of them because 3 things happened. Some of Patton's men on a mercy mission heard of a salt mine with secrets. Eisenhower and Patton, with others, descended half a mile into the mine. German currency, art treasures, which Eisenhower is looking at it, assorted gold and silver, and about 250 million in gold bars was found. Number 2, still April the 12th, they saw their first Nazi concentration camp. Now, this is not one that you hear about much. This is Gotha, G-O-T-H-A. And later Eisenhower said, "I have never at any other time experienced an equal sense of shock. I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in a position from then on to testify at first hand about these things in case they ever grew up at home, the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda." And indeed, those stories did spring up. And number 3, Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley found out just after midnight that Franklin D. Roosevelt had died on April the 12th. Ike had been in close contact with the president in Washington, Casablanca, Tunisia, and Cairo. He didn't really feel that he knew him, but he had had discussions with him and had been named Supreme Commander by him. And all 3 of them really felt the loss. This is a monument to FDR that's in Oslo at the head of the field there. Following Hitler's suicide by a week, on May 7, 1945, the German agreed to the terms, unconditional surrender, and the war in Europe was finally over. Eisenhower's message of victory from his headquarters in Reims, France, was very simple. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7, 1945. At the Guildhall in London in June 1945, when accepting an honor, Ike used these words: "Humility must always be the portion of any man who receives a claim earned in the blood of his followers and the sacrifice of his friends. The only attitude in which a commander may with satisfaction receive the tributes of his friends is an humble acknowledgement that no matter how unworthy he may be, his position is a symbol of great human forces that have labored arduously and successfully for a righteous cause." In case you don't know it, that is Tower Bridge in London. Further on, I come from the very heart of America. In the superficial aspects by which we ordinarily recognize family relationships, the town where I was born, the one where I was reared, are far separated from this great city. Abilene, Kansas, and Denison, Texas would altogether equal in size possibly 1/500th of a part of Great London. But Neither London nor Abilene, sisters under the skin, will sell her birthright for physical safety, her liberty for mere existence. And this is the great St. Paul's that you saw in the famous photograph from the Blitz. Yes, it came through the war. Now, these pictures that you're going to see are found in an American cemetery, the land given by Cambridge University to the people of the United States. And you will see crosses, a chapel, and then a peace rose. With me, raise your thoughts, perhaps even a prayer, to the people who carried out the crusade in Africa and Europe. You've heard the names of several of the generals, but remember the lower-ranking officers and the enlisted personnel, the Willies and Joes, and all the men and women who made up the supporting forces. I expect you to think about those who died or were wounded, but please don't forget the ones who survived it all and came home, including those who are still with us, some of you right here in the audience. The world owes a debt to these people, living and dead. Don't ever forget them. And here is some of what England paid. This was the great Coventry Cathedral. Ike returned to the United States with much acclaim. The honors and parades seemed endless. But he got back home to Abilene, Kansas in June 1945. You might remember his statement, "The proudest thing I can claim is that I am from Abilene." Ike and Marshal Zhukov of the Soviet Union became viceroys over Germany. They became friends and had a warm relationship. These two went to Moscow in August 1945 and met with Stalin. Ike really believed that the United States and Russia could exist in the same world as friends. But at that time, this was still the Iron Curtain. I took this picture as we were going through that corridor I showed you, and we had passed through this checkpoint going into West Berlin. That guard tower indeed has a machine gun in it, and you can see the plowed land and the double fences and the open area where people could get trapped. John Eisenhower was with Ike on this trip, and I want to show you a picture. The people of Scotland gave Eisenhower the use of this castle, this is Calzine, for as long as he lived, and that is Eisenhower with probably the best picture I have of John. So John was with Ike on this trip to Moscow, and when the party was in Leningrad, John was asked to offer a toast at a luncheon. He was prepared. Quote, "I have been in Russia several days and have listened to many toasts. I've heard the virtues of every Allied ruler, every prominent marshal, general, admiral, and air commander toasted. I have yet to hear a toast to the most important Russian in World War II. Gentlemen, will you please drink with me to the common soldier of the Great Red Army?" End of quote. Marshal Zhukov said to Ike that the two of them must be getting old to wait for a young lieutenant to remind us who really won the war. These are Russian soldiers at Stalingrad. While that visit was going on, the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan, and World War II was finally over. This is the B-29 boxcar. It's in the museum down by Dayton, and this is the one that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. Ike invited Marshal Zhukov to the United States, but the visit was never made. Both sides were viewing the other with much suspicion, and the world moved rapidly towards the Cold War. Ike felt that it didn't have to happen, but neither Ike nor Marshal Zhukov was making policy. And this is part of the Berlin Wall. You see, part of the wall was achieved by knocking down three sides of a house and then bricking up or blocking up the windows and doors. With reluctance, Eisenhower, at the urging of President Harry Truman, became Chief of Staff, replacing Marshall. Ike carried on the dreary business of cutting back the size of the army while maintaining security. He was in this position from December 1945 until 1948, dealing with Congress and the executive branch and not really liking the job very much. Rumors were flying all through this time, and even before he came back from Europe, that he would run for president. But Ike would have none of that. And I'm not just sure why I put a picture of the Jefferson Memorial here. I just like the Jefferson Memorial, I suppose. In 1948, two important things happened. He published Crusade in Europe, and he became president of Columbia University. As to the book, it was written by Eisenhower. Remember that much of his advancement in the early days of World War II was because of his thinking ability and his written words. He did not need a ghostwriter. Ike told them that they wanted his brother Milton, that's this man, for president of Columbia, but the powers on the board of trustees wanted that magic name, Ike. He thought that in time he could do some good at Columbia, but the staff and faculty of an institution of learning is far different from a military situation. Nevertheless, Columbia University probably did not suffer from having Ike as its president for a few years, and Ike and Lou Little, the football coach, got along famously. Then Eisenhower was back in uniform and in an active military role as the first Supreme Commander of NATO Defense Forces. This meant organizing and negotiating military cooperation in Western Europe. If there had to be a NATO because of Russian pressure moving the world into the Cold War, then Ike was probably the best choice to get it started. But renewed pressure was being mounted on Eisenhower to come back to the United States and run for president. After saying no for so many years, he was finally convinced that his country needed him in this new capacity. The battle for the Republican nomination was rougher than the race against Adlai Stevenson. Incidentally, this is one of the original buttons. This one I've purchased within the last 5 years at Abilene. In the race, his biggest regret was not defending George Marshall against Senator McCarthy when campaigning in Wisconsin. True, he had defended Marshall several times during the campaign, but he must have spent time regretting that he had followed the advice of Wisconsin Republicans. Dwight D. Eisenhower, that's Milton with Ike and Mamie. Dwight D. Eisenhower was to serve 2 full terms, 1953 through 1961, as President of the United States. Ike had made a pledge during the campaign that if elected, he would go to Korea and try to figure out a solution to end that war. This did not sit well with Harry Truman, but relations between Eisenhower and Truman had long since deteriorated. Ike did go to Korea before becoming president, and later he did bring about an end to the Korean conflict. And this is a simple but magnificent memorial to that fact down in Massillon, Ohio. A number of people, especially reporters, thought that Eisenhower tried to stay above the issues and the conflicts during his time as President of the United States. This is one by Herblock, March 27, 1957, Eisenhower in a helicopter above the issues. But you must remember that Ike usually studied an issue before jumping into the fray. In the words of Mike Royko, the Chicago columnist, he didn't think it necessary to send his press secretary out every 15 minutes to give reporters an update on how he did his job during the last 15 minutes and a preview of how he would do it during the next 15. You could actually go several days at a time without knowing what the President of the United States was doing with his time. And I, for one, would like to see us return to that type of an arrangement. In the cabinet, John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State and Charlie Wilson was Defense Secretary. Sherman Adams was assistant to the president and Richard Nixon was the elected vice president. In April 1953, Ike spoke to the American Society of Newspaper Editors. His speech became known as the Chance for Peace. every gun that is fired, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And Ike and his administration did things while he was president. Settled the country down and brought years of peace. And this is at Camp David, Ike and Nikita Khrushchev, September the 25th, 1959. They proposed an open sky policy to the communist world. Sent troops into the Little Rock school situation to enforce the ruling of the Supreme Court. This one was one for which he was really criticized for dragging his feet. And Ike was the one that finally defused Senator Joseph McCarthy. They put in motion the building of the interstate highway system, which so many of us use today, and put in motion the Mission 66 program to help the national park system. And we need another such program today. And then with a push from Ike in 1959, Alaska, represented here by Glacier Bay National Park, and Hawaii attained statehood. But all was not grand. In October 1956, Hungarian people revolted against the communist leaders, and the effort was crushed by Russian tanks. The United States was criticized for not stepping into the fight. In October 1957, the Russians launched the first man-made satellite around the Earth. And this is a big one. On May 1st, 1960, a U-2 spy plane went down in the Soviet Union, and its pilot, Gary Powers, was captured. This is him here. This was the final day before a ban on such flights was to take place as ordered by Eisenhower. But the damage was done, and the upcoming Paris summit meeting was doomed. And with it went Ike's hope for a thawing of the Cold War. Now, this next one I'm speaking as a member of the Sierra Club. Ike's administration launched water projects in the West, including the Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River. When that dam was built, it silted too quickly, the water evaporated too fast, and the reservoir destroyed forever Cathedral in the Desert and other scenic wonders. And this is Cathedral in the Desert taken out of a Sierra Club book. That whole thing is loaded with water. And under this picture in the book are these words: remember these things lost, and under the vaulting roof of the cathedral burn a candle to the memory. During his presidency, Ike suffered 3 attacks. Heart, September 1955, intestines, June 56, a stroke, November 57. He survived them all and spent his last years at the farm at Gettysburg with Mamie. Dwight Eisenhower closed out his presidency with a farewell address. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. In spite of stories to the contrary, Mr. Eisenhower read newspapers. He read many Western stories for relaxation, but they were not the only reading that he did. This is Ike and Mamie in the library out at the Eisenhower Center in Abilene. He could come forward with numerous stories from a wide-ranging background. While those stories were never off color, he did use profanity in private. The smile was sincere, but it was more likely to appear in public than in private. Except on sad occasions, he probably couldn't even stop it. Now Ike and Mamie retired to their farm at Gettysburg. For Ike, the change of pace may have been too abrupt after all the years of being in the thick of things. But he did settle in and with his partners raised a dairy herd. Later they switched to Angus cattle. I guess they didn't like the milking. In support of the animals, corn, hay, and wheat were also raised. His idea was to have a farm that followed good conservation practices and would be better when he left it than when he bought it. Incidentally, the porch, and you're looking at the inside of it, doesn't look much like a porch, does it? That porch was the Eisenhower's favorite room, and guests were entertained there. And John and his family lived only about a mile away. In 1963, with Walter Cronkite, Eisenhower returned to the beaches at Normandy. It was called by others the scene of his greatest triumph. But with the background of row on row of white crosses, it must have been at best a bittersweet experience. In 1966, Ike accompanied the body of Icky back to Abilene, and he was buried there in the chapel at Eisenhower Center. You'll see that chapel in just a moment. During the years at the farm, Eisenhower was writing and keeping regular office hours at Gettysburg College, in the room right behind where this statue is. He often met with business and political associates, here with John Kennedy. Ike often took guests over to view the Gettysburg battlefield. And here's the great North Carolina monument carved by Borglum. Since military history was a subject in which Eisenhower excelled, these were fortunate people. You can climb to the top of a tower on Seminary Ridge, the Confederate lines, and see the Eisenhower farm. And indeed, that's where this picture is taken from. In March 1969, Ike was stricken once again, was taken to Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington. At the age of 78, he died there on March 28, 1969. Then, after lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda, he was taken back home to Abilene, Kansas, and buried next to Icky in the chapel at Eisenhower Center. Mamie continued to live at the farm at Gettysburg for 10 more years until she died in 1979 and was buried next to Ike and Icky in Abilene in that chapel. The country owed this man, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a debt of such proportions that it could never repay him. Dwight Eisenhower was very intelligent. He had a wide-ranging knowledge of Greek and Roman history. Ike could hold his own in history discussions with such people as Winston Churchill. His knowledge was extensive about Lincoln and his writings. The man's principles were of the highest order. This was an honest man. You're safe in calling him one of our greatest heroes. May he rest in peace. America to northern Canada. Now, please don't expect easy answers. You'll get a few points to ponder, and perhaps you'll end up with more questions than those few that we started with. But coming up with questions is a good step in learning some of nature's secrets. We'll talk about those birds a little bit later on, but there are snow geese over in Nebraska. And you'll see Canada geese, and you will see sandhill cranes. Birds migrate in the spring to reach locations where breeding, egg laying, and feeding of young can be done with a real chance at continuing the species. These first few pictures, there are about 8 out of them, will be Canada geese, and many of you who are looking at this will know that bird. Food must be quickly available and plentiful, not just for the migrating birds, but for the young